The altimeter was spinning the wrong direction when Myra Volkov realized, with the particular calm of someone who has spent 11 years learning that panic is a choice, and she had never once chosen it, that the left seat had gone very quiet. Not quiet the way cockpits go quiet during climb, that comfortable settled silence when the engines find their cruise note and the radio drops to routine chatter. Quiet the way a room goes quiet when something essential has been removed from it. Captain Yevgeny Sorokin was slumped against the window, his shoulder pressed into the glass, his headset still on, his hands loose in his lap. First Officer Dmitry Basiev had gone 30 seconds earlier. Myra had watched him from the jump seat, watched the way his hands stopped moving first, then his head dropped forward, then nothing. She was 12 years old. She had been flying with her father for 11 of those years, meaning she had been in cockpits before she had been in classrooms, meaning the aluminum and glass and instrument panel in front of her was more familiar than any classroom wall had ever been, and she understood with the complete unsentimentality of a child who had been raised to observe rather than react, that the aircraft was now hers and that the aircraft did not care how old she was. The Boeing 737-800 was at flight level 350, which meant 35,000 feet, which meant 6.6 miles above the Caspian Sea, which meant that the distance between this aircraft and the ground was enormous and the distance between functional pilots and the aircraft was total. Myra did not move for 3 seconds. She counted them. Her father had taught her to count before acting because the 3-second rule existed specifically to separate instinct from panic, and instinct was useful and panic was not. On 3 she slid forward from the jump seat, stepping between the two unconscious men with the practiced economy of someone who understood that a cockpit has exactly enough room for the people it was designed for and not 1 centimeter more. She took the right seat. She did not touch the controls yet. She looked at every instrument in sequence, left to right, the way her father had shown her, because the aircraft was telling her everything and she needed to listen before she could respond. If you've ever wondered what a child raised in the cockpit sounds like on an emergency frequency, the answer is nothing like what you would expect. She did not sound frightened. She did not sound young. She sounded like someone who had been taught that the radio is a tool and tools are used precisely or not at all. And the people on the ground who heard that voice for the first time, controllers who had spent careers listening to professional flight crews work through emergencies with trained composure, would later say that they understood within the first sentence that whoever was on the other end of that transmission had something that could not be taught in a classroom. Before we go further into what happened at 35,000 feet over the Caspian, before we talk about the controllers who worked the emergency, and the pilots who coached her from the ground and the 312 passengers in the cabin who did not know what was happening 4 feet forward of the cockpit door, if you're new to this channel, please take a moment to subscribe and ring the notification bell, because every week we bring you stories like this one. Stories from the extreme edge of human experience and aviation history, stories that deserve to be told in full, and this one deserves to be told in full. Myra Volkov was born in Tbilisi, Georgia, in the middle of a decade when Georgia was rebuilding itself from the ground up, which meant she was born into a family that understood the relationship between uncertainty and competence in the way only people living through institutional chaos can understand it. Her father, Captain Alexei Volkov, had been flying since before the Soviet Union had finished collapsing, which meant he had learned his trade in one country and practiced it in several others, accumulating a kind of knowledge that transcended any single aviation authority or regulatory framework. He flew because he was constitutionally unsuited to anything that didn't require complete attention and because, as he told Myra from an age before she could fully understand the statement, the sky was the only place where the rules made complete sense. On the ground, systems were political. In the air, physics was in charge and physics did not play favorites. He took her to the cockpit the first time when she was 14 months old, which was a violation of approximately every regulation that existed at the time, and which he did anyway because he had looked at his daughter and seen, in the particular focused attention she paid to everything that moved and made noise, something that he recognized. He was not projecting, he was observing. He was a professional observer of systems, and he observed in his daughter a relationship with mechanical complexity that he understood because he shared it. By the time Myra was 4, she could identify the primary flight instruments by name. By the time she was 6, she understood the relationship between airspeed and lift in terms a physics teacher would not have been embarrassed by. By the time she was 8, she had sat in the right seat during cruise flight on at least 30 occasions, always with her father's hand close to the controls, always with the understanding that the aircraft was his and she was learning, and that learning required attention and patience and the willingness to be wrong before you were right. By the time she was 12, she had accumulated something that no logbook in any aviation authority system would ever formally recognize, somewhere between 300 and 400 hours of what her father called observational flight time, which was not a legal category but was a real category, the kind of category that exists in practical knowledge rather than regulatory frameworks. She understood the 737 the way children understand the houses they grow up in, not because anyone had formally instructed her, because she had been present and she had paid attention and the aircraft had been her home longer than any classroom had been. The flight was Baku to Almaty, which is a route that crosses the Caspian and then the steppe of Kazakhstan, not one of the dramatic routes, not one that appeared in travel magazines or attracted attention from aviation enthusiasts, just a functional connection between two functional cities carrying business travelers and families in the ordinary freight of ordinary lives. Captain Sorokin had 17 years on the line. First Officer Bassif had 4. Between them, they had flown this route more than either could precisely count. It was, in the language of routine, a milk run, which is precisely the kind of flight on which no one expects anything to go wrong, and which is therefore the kind of flight on which the absence of expectation can become its own hazard. What went wrong had nothing to do with the aircraft and everything to do with the meal service, which is a sentence that sounds absurd until you understand the specific chain of causation, which is neither absurd nor unprecedented, which is in fact documented in aviation safety literature with a frequency that should concern anyone who has ever eaten the chicken on a 2-hour flight. Both pilots had ordered from the same provision batch. Both pilots had eaten at nearly the same time, Sorokin first and then Bassif 12 minutes later, with the staggering that regulations required specifically to prevent simultaneous incapacitation, except that the regulation assumed the incapacitation would be rapid rather than the particular delayed onset nausea and dizziness that followed, which came on gradually enough that neither man recognized its source, until Bassif had already lost consciousness, and Sorokin was 30 seconds behind him. Myra had eaten nothing. She had brought food from home, a practice her father had established when she was small and which had become habit, because airline catering was fine but her mother's cooking was better, and the small orange container in her bag was evidence of a preference that would, on this particular flight, matter enormously. She was reading when Bassif went down. She was working through a book about aerodynamics that her father had given her for her birthday, which was not the kind of book most 12-year-olds would choose to spend a flight reading, and which she was reading not because she had to, but because the subject interested her with the same completeness that it interested her father, that particular absorption in mechanical truth that she had inherited or absorbed, or simply grown into through proximity and attention. She heard the change in his breathing first. Then she looked up and saw the posture change, the way a person's body reorganizes itself when consciousness withdraws, and she understood what she was seeing because she had read about hypoxia and incapacitation in the same books she read about aerodynamics, because her father had taught her that understanding failure was as important as understanding normal operation. She watched Sorokin for confirmation. He was still conscious, barely, his eyes fighting to stay focused on the instruments with the particular determination of a professional who does not want to accept what is happening to his body. He managed to look back at her. He said one word, he said her name, and then he was gone. The aircraft at this point was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It was maintaining altitude, it was maintaining course. The autopilot was engaged and functioning, and the 737 had no particular interest in the condition of its crew beyond what the instruments required. It would have flown on perfectly for another 2 hours and 40 minutes, following its programmed course before anything changed. The problem was not what the aircraft was doing. The problem was what it would need to do eventually, which was descend and approach and land at Almaty International Airport, and that was not something autopilot alone could accomplish. And the only person in the forward section of the aircraft who was conscious and understood what that meant was 12 years old and sitting in the right seat trying to decide what to do first. She decided to get on the radio first. This was objectively the correct decision, and the fact that she made it as her first action rather than touching the controls, or trying to wake the pilots, or doing any of the other things a less trained person might have done first tells you something about what those 11 years of proximity had actually produced. The radio was a tool. Tools were used precisely or not at all. She needed help, and the radio was how you got help, and therefore the radio was first. Any station, this is Flight Ka 447, we have a problem. She knew the correct phraseology. She knew it because her father had taught her that the radio has a language and the language exists because it eliminates ambiguity, and ambiguity in aviation is a kind of danger, not as dramatic as structural failure or weather, but just as real. She had heard thousands of radio transmissions in those 300+ hours in jump seats and right seats, and she had, without consciously deciding to, absorbed the cadence and vocabulary of professional communication the way a child absorbs a first language. Not by studying it, by being immersed in it until it was simply how you spoke. The response from Almaty Center came in 14 seconds. Controllers are trained to respond to unusual transmissions immediately, and the transmission they had just received was, by any measure, unusual. The voice was wrong in a way that took a professional listener less than a second to register. not the wrong words or the wrong procedure, but the wrong age. And that wrongness triggered an alert response that is different from the standard acknowledgement response, sharper and more focused. Station calling, say again your call sign and state the nature of your problem. She said it again, call sign, aircraft type, position, that both pilots were unconscious, that she was 12 years old, that she had been in cockpits her entire life, that she needed help but she also needed them to know she was not completely without resources. This last part was important. She understood at 12 that the difference between a controller who would help her effectively and a controller who would be paralyzed by the situation was the difference between the controller understanding she had some capability and the controller thinking she had none. She was giving them information they needed to calibrate their response, which is exactly what a professional would have done, and she was doing it at age 12 in a right seat over the Caspian. There are people who are gifted with precise recall of specific moments, and senior controller Armen Beksitov was one of them, and he would remember the exact quality of her voice for the rest of his career. Not the fear in it, because there was not very much fear in it, but the focus. The narrow, directed attention of someone who has identified a problem and is in the process of solving it and needs specific assistance with specific elements of the solution, not reassurance, not sympathy, not the kind of emotional scaffolding that untrained people reach for when they are frightened. She needed technical help. She was asking for technical help. She was 12 years old. Beksitov had been a controller for 19 years. He had worked 3 declared emergencies, 2 of which were false alarms and 1 of which was a cargo aircraft with a hydraulic problem that had resolved itself on approach. He had never worked anything like this. No one had ever worked anything like this. He pulled every resource he had, which in practice meant getting his supervisor involved immediately and getting word out on the aviation network for a qualified 737 captain who could talk to this child from the ground, and doing both of these things while maintaining calm radio contact with the aircraft, because the worst thing he could do right now was let the channel go quiet. Ka 447, we have you. I'm Armen. I'm going to stay with you. What does your autopilot show? She looked at the autopilot panel and described it. Altitude hold, heading hold, speed stable. She read the numbers like someone reading a weather report, factual and sequential, and Beksitov noted the altitude and the position and started doing the math on time to destination and fuel state and descent profile, because those were the numbers that would determine how much time they had and therefore how they would use it. They had 2 hours and 23 minutes, which was simultaneously an enormous amount of time and nowhere near enough time. Enormous because it meant she didn't have to do anything for the immediate crisis management phase. The aircraft was stable and would remain stable, and the situation was not yet acute in the way that required immediate action. Nowhere near enough because 2 hours and 23 minutes was not enough time to teach a 12-year-old to land a Boeing 737. Except that they weren't starting from zero, and Beksitov understood this within the first 3 minutes of speaking with her. She knew what a localizer was. She knew what a glide slope was. She understood the relationship between thrust and airspeed and altitude in terms that required no translation. When he asked her to read the fuel state, she read it correctly and understood what the numbers meant. When he mentioned the autopilot disconnect altitude, she knew what that meant. She was not a trained pilot, but she was not a passenger who had accidentally wandered into the cockpit. She was something in between, something for which no regulation existed and no procedure had been written, and that thing was actually, in the specific context of this specific emergency, almost enough. Almost, the gap between almost enough and enough was the landing, and that gap was the problem. A 737 approach and landing involves somewhere between 80 and 120 discrete actions depending on conditions, pilot preference, and company procedure. Most of those actions are either automated or procedural and require only that the pilot know the procedure and execute it in order. Some of them require physical feel, stick inputs, rudder corrections, the particular judgment of the flare that converts a controlled descent into a ground contact that the aircraft and its passengers survive. That judgment is what training builds over hundreds of hours. That judgment is what Myra did not have. What she had was everything else. And everything else, when supported by 2 controllers and 2 volunteer pilots who had by this point joined the effort from the ground, might just be enough. Captain Dmitry Orlov had been sitting in an airport lounge in Baku when the call went out. He was deadheading back to Almaty after a positioning flight, and he had a 737 type rating and 18 years on the line. And he heard what was happening on the aviation network, and he found the nearest telephone and called the frequency, and said he was available, and Beksitov patched him through to the aircraft with the focused efficiency of someone who had stopped being surprised by the situation and started being purely operational. This was also the correct response. Surprise was a luxury. The aircraft was not interested in what was surprising. The aircraft was continuing toward Almaty at 35,000 feet, and it needed to be down by the time it got there. Myra, my name is Dimitri. I'm a 737 captain, and I've been flying this aircraft for 18 years. I want you to know something before we talk about flying. You've done everything right so far, everything. The radio call, the autopilot check, reading me the instruments, all of it was correct. I need you to keep doing what you've been doing. Can you do that? She said she could, he noted, as Beksitov had noted the quality of the response. Not reassured, she had not needed reassurance, but confirmed. She was integrating the information and moving forward, and that was exactly what was needed. What followed over the next 2 hours was something that aviation training manuals had never been written to accommodate, and which required Orlov and Beksitov and the second pilot, a first officer named Sol Nerlanovna, who was 737 rated and who had joined the effort 30 minutes in, to essentially construct a teaching curriculum in real time, delivered over radio to a 12-year-old over the Caspian. They worked backwards from the landing. What did she need to know to land? What of that did she already know? What of the remainder could she learn in 2 hours? What could they simplify or automate or proceduralize so that she needed to know less rather than more? It became clear within the first hour that the approach itself was manageable. Orlov walked her through the autopilot approach mode with the patience of someone who had taught thousands of students and the precision of someone who understood that imprecision here had consequences he was not going to think about because thinking about them would not help. She set the frequencies. She set the approach mode. She confirmed the glide slope capture. She did all of this with a competence that was not exactly calm and not exactly trained, but was something that worked. Something that was made of 11 years of being present in cockpits and watching how things were done and filing it away with the particular organization of a child who notices everything. The flare was the problem. The flare was always going to be the problem. The flare is the last moment of an approach, when the pilot raises the nose slightly to arrest the descent rate and allows the aircraft to settle onto the runway. And it is the part of landing that is most resistant to verbal instruction because it is fundamentally a physical sense, how the aircraft feels, how the rate of closure with the runway changes, when to move and how much. Orlov had taught it to students in simulators with his hand over theirs, feeling the input before they made it. He could not do that over a radio from the ground. He made a decision at 1 hour 40 minutes. He decided to be honest with her about the flare. Myra, I need to tell you something about the landing. The last part, the flare, it's the hardest to explain over a radio. It's a feeling. I can describe it, but I can't completely teach it without being there. I want you to know that so you're not surprised. What I can tell you is what to watch for, what the correct visual picture looks like, what to do with your hands and when. And I'm going to tell you the truth. It may be rough. You may come in harder than a fully qualified pilot would. That's acceptable. Rough landing on a runway is survivable. Good. I need you to tell me you understand that. She understood. She said so. She also said something that Orlov would remember for the rest of his career. She said, "My father always told me that the aircraft wants to land. I just have to let it." Alexei Volkov had been a good teacher. Whatever else was true, he had been a good teacher. At 1 hour out, the cabin crew became fully aware of what was happening. The senior flight attendant, a woman named Aner Bykova, who had 15 years on the line and who had been managing the passenger cabin with the controlled calm of a professional who understands that passengers should not be alarmed unless they need to be alarmed, had been told by Myra over the intercom 40 minutes in. Aner had processed the information, asked 2 clarifying questions, confirmed the situation, and then done her job, which was to prepare the cabin for an emergency landing without causing a panic that would make the emergency landing harder. She was very good at her job. The passengers were aware there was a medical situation with the flight crew. They were not aware of the precise nature of the situation. They were braced in the general sense, which was what was needed. For the record, dear viewer, if you're watching this and you've ever wondered what you would want a flight attendant to do in an emergency, exactly this. Bykova's management of those 312 passengers in that cabin may have contributed as much to the survival of everyone on board as anything that happened in the cockpit. Keep that in mind the next time you see a flight attendant doing their pre-flight safety demonstration. They are not there to hand out pretzels. They are there for moments like this. We are right now approaching the hardest part of this story to tell, which is the approach and landing itself. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, this is a good moment to do it, because what happens in the next few minutes of that flight is something that deserves full attention, and we want you to be here for the rest of what we tell. Subscribe, ring the bell, and let's stay with Myra. Almaty International Airport had been alerted. Every resource was on the field. Fire trucks were positioned. Ambulances were staged. The runway had been cleared and would remain clear. Air traffic had been rerouted so that the frequency was as quiet as possible. Controllers who were not working the emergency had left the room because fewer voices was better than more voices, and the people who needed to be there were already there. The approach was ILS runway 5, which gave a glide path and a localizer, which meant the autopilot would handle the approach path if the frequencies were set correctly, and the modes were engaged correctly, which Myra had done under Orlov's guidance an hour ago and which she had confirmed 3 times since. At 20 miles she started the descent from cruising altitude, following the step-downs that Orlov called out, reducing speed at the waypoints he specified, confirming every configuration change out loud over the radio in the format she had absorbed from 11 years of hearing how pilots talk to each other. At 15 miles the glide slope captured. At 12 miles she extended flaps to 15 degrees. At 8 miles, gear down. Orlov was talking continuously now, not instructions so much as calibration, describing what she should be seeing, what the instruments should be showing, what the feel of the controls should be, using her responses to judge whether she was where she needed to be. The aircraft was slightly high on the glide slope at 7 miles, which is common and correctable. She corrected it. She reduced thrust marginally, let the aircraft settle back to path, confirmed path capture. Orlov said nothing for 4 seconds, which was its own kind of communication. At 5 miles she could see the runway. She had seen runways from cockpits before, but not like this. Not from the left seat with no one else capable, not with the runway growing in the windscreen at the rate it grows on an instrument approach. Her father had described this to her once. He had said that the first time you see a runway on a real approach, really see it, really understand that this is the actual thing and not a simulate or picture, it changes shape in your mind. It becomes more specific, more fixed, more real than anything has ever been real in your entire life. She said over the radio in a voice that did not shake, "I have the runway visual." Orlov said, "Myra, you've done everything right, you're on path, you're on speed. This is the last part. I'm going to talk you through the flare. Listen to every word." At 500 feet the aircraft was passing through 500 feet per minute descent rate, which is correct, which is exactly correct, and the runway was filling the windscreen the way it does on a correct approach. The precise visual picture that represents a correctly flown glide path, and Myra Volkov was looking at it with the 11 years of absorbed knowledge about what correct looks like, and understanding that this was correct and that correct was what she had. At 50 feet Orlov said, "Now, gently nose up, just a little, feel it." She pulled back just a little, the nose came up, the descent rate began to reduce. The runway came up to meet the aircraft with the relationship between velocity and surface that has been the final moment of every aircraft landing in history, that negotiation between human machine and physical Earth, and she felt, not imagined, not calculated, felt in her hands and her spine and the particular way the seat pressure changes as the aircraft attitude changes. She felt the aircraft wanting to settle. She let it. The main gear touched, it was hard, harder than qualified. The aircraft bounced once, a short bounce, less than 18 inches, came back down and this time stayed down. The nose wheel came forward more quickly than it should have, which produced a sensation that the passengers in the cabin would describe later as significant. But it came forward and stayed forward, and the aircraft was on the runway and decelerating, and the runway ahead was still long. Still there, still runway, and the auto brakes were working, and the thrust reversers were deployed, and the aircraft was slowing, slowing, slowing. It stopped with 4,000 feet of runway remaining. There was a silence on the frequency that lasted for approximately 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which no one said anything because the appropriate thing to say had not yet been invented. Then Beksitov, who had been on frequency for 2 hours and 41 minutes, who had not left his position for a single moment of that time, said in a voice that was as close to breaking as a professional voice gets, "Ka 447, confirm you're stopped on the runway." "Affirmative," said Myra Volkov, "stopped on the runway." "Are you injured? Are the pilots showing any response?" She checked. Sorokin was beginning to stir. Basiev was still unconscious but breathing. She reported this. "Emergency services are on their way to the aircraft. Myra, you did it." She said, "The aircraft did it, I just let it." Emergency vehicles reached the aircraft in 90 seconds. Both pilots were evacuated and taken to hospital where they would recover fully. The food poisoning severe but not lethal. The timing catastrophic but the outcome ultimately not. The 312 passengers disembarked in a state of delayed awareness, most of them not understanding what had happened until they were in the terminal building, and the word was moving through the crowd like weather. 12 years old alone, she landed the aircraft, and the disbelief was universal, and the disbelief was in every verifiable particular incorrect. There were investigations, which was correct because investigations are how aviation learns from its events, normal and abnormal. The catering company was the subject of the food safety investigation. Airline procedures for pilot meal staggering were reviewed. The regulatory question of what to do with Myra Volkov was answered, ultimately, by acknowledging that there was no category in any existing regulatory framework for what she had done, which was technically neither legal nor illegal because no one had ever felt the need to write a rule for it. Captain Alexei Volkov was reached by phone in Tbilisi, while his daughter was still on final approach, having been notified by the airline when they could not reach him earlier. And he spent the last 4 minutes of that approach unable to do anything except listen to the frequency, which had been patched to him because someone at the airline had made a human decision rather than a regulatory one. He heard his daughter's voice. He heard Orlov talking her through the flare. He heard the bounce. He heard the rollout. He heard the stop. He said nothing for 11 seconds. Then he said, in Georgian, a single sentence that the person who was holding the phone for him did not speak Georgian and therefore could not translate, but whose meaning they understood completely from the tone. Myra's description of the landing, given in about a dozen different interviews over the following months, was always consistent. She always said the same thing. She said she had done what her father taught her. She said she had listened. She said the aircraft wanted to land and she let it. She never called it brave. She never called it exceptional. She described it the way her father described his flights, as a sequence of decisions, most of them trained, a few of them learned in the moment, all of them made with the information available and the resources present. She obtained her student pilot license at the earliest legal age and her private pilot certificate 18 months later. She was instrument rated at 17 and multi-engine rated at 18. She flew her first commercial flight as first officer at 24 on This Is Not a Detail the Story Invented. This is not a detail anyone would have dared invent, the Baku-Almaty route. She checked the catering before every flight she ever flew. She ate food from home. Captain Dmitry Orlov attended her type rating check ride as an observer, having requested the accommodation from the airline and having received it, because some moments deserve witnesses. He said afterward that watching her fly the check ride was a particular kind of experience, not because it was remarkable that she passed, because it was so completely natural, the way she inhabited the aircraft, the relationship between her hands and the controls and the instruments and the sky outside. As if she had been doing it all her life, which, in the only way that ultimately mattered, she had. Senior Controller Armen Beksitov retired 11 years after the Almaty event. At his retirement party, someone asked him what the most memorable moment of his career had been. He said it without hesitation. He described those 2 hours and 41 minutes. He described the voice on the frequency. He described the silence when the aircraft stopped. He said that in 19 years of working approaches, he had heard a great many voices on the radio, young and old, confident and frightened, trained and underprepared, and that he had learned over those years to hear in a voice the thing that the words alone did not say. And that what he had heard in the voice of Myra Volkov, at age 12, over the Caspian at 35,000 feet, was the thing he had heard in the voices of the very best pilots he had ever worked, a quality of attention that was absolute, an absence of the particular noise that fear makes in the radio, and in its place something quieter and more powerful and almost impossible to describe, which was the sound of a person who was completely, entirely present in the moment they were in, with nothing held back and nowhere else to be. She would go on a fly for 22 years. She would accumulate 17,000 hours. She would eventually become a captain on the same aircraft type on which she had once at 12 years old guided 312 souls down to earth on an empty runway in Kazakhstan. She never publicized the Almaty event professionally. She did not hide it, but she did not use it as a credential because she did not believe it was a credential. It was something that had happened. She had done what was in front of her to do. The alternative had not been acceptable. The people who flew with her as crew over those 22 years would talk about various things: her precision, her situational awareness, her particular economy with the radio, the way she could read an approach from 60 miles out and know whether it was going to be clean or complicated. But what they came back to when they talked about her was something simpler than any technical quality. They said that when things went wrong, and in 22 years of commercial aviation things go wrong, not catastrophically most of the time but wrong enough, whether in systems and the ordinary mechanical failures that keep maintenance departments employed. When things went wrong, there was a quality in the cockpit with her that was different from other flight decks. Something steadier, something that made the problem feel smaller not because she minimized it, but because she was simply completely adequate to it. There is a word for what Myra Volkov had, and it is not courage, though courage was present. It is not skill, though skill was present and grew and deepened over a career. The word is presence. The word is the kind of fundamental, rooted, grounded presence that allows a person to be entirely in the moment they are in, with the resources they have, addressing the problem in front of them without any part of themselves elsewhere. It is the rarest quality. It cannot be taught in a classroom. It can be taught by a father in a cockpit over 11 years if the father is a good teacher and the student is paying attention. She is still flying. The aircraft still wants to land. She still lets it. And when you needed her at 35,000 feet over a cold sea on a day when everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, she arrived in the left seat like the only person on earth who had been made for exactly that moment. Because she had been. And that, more than any certification or logbook entry or ceremony, is what made her irreplaceable.